So today I have Kunal Adnani joining me on the Decoded podcast. Kunal is a very senior executive in a family-run business, and but more importantly, he's a very close friend of mine, and he's also someone who's like a voice of reason and a source of encouragement for me since the time I know him. And in today's episode, we are not going to talk about the professional side of his life. We don't even need to go there. What we will be focusing on is a story which is extremely close to his heart. And you might have figured out from his name, Adnani, like his family name, that he is a Sindhi. And the story that has been a part of his life since he was like very young is the story about Sindhi Hindus and their migration during the partition of India and Pakistan. Right now, now, unlike other incidents which happened during this period, this partition period, this is one of those stories which has not received the the public attention, the discussion uh, that it should have. And 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 in today's show, what Kunal is going to do is he's going to try and bring this back into focus. um, Obviously, Kunal is not claiming to be an expert on the topic. He is just a curious soul, like who's trying to figure out his own roots and his community's roots. And uh, he has read a lot, and he has spoken to people in the family also a lot. And over the years, he has this is a topic which has been like a recurrent theme in his life. So in the show notes, on below the YouTube video, you'll be able to see a lot of references for anyone who is curious about this topic. And if you want to do some further reading on the topic, where should you go? Who are the people who are authorities on the subject, and what else you can read about? But the intent over here is to bring a topic which is less spoken about, which is often there is silence when this topic comes about. So the intent is to spread the awareness, bring it back into focus. And if you're someone who's watching this show, and if you relate to the topic, or if you're a part of the community yourself, if you relate to the topic and you have any views, you have personal experiences around this topic, or if you have if you have further sources around this topic, please share, please help spread the word, please comment. And also, Kunal is not a professional podcast recorder. He's generally a very quiet, introverted person. But for today's episode, he's going to keep referring to his notes. And let me tell you, Kunal, at the very beginning, that it's completely fine. Let's keep it natural, however you're comfortable with. So on that note, lovely to have you on the pod, and welcome.
Thanks so much, Rahul, for that intro. Let me firstly start by saying that definitely not an expert on the topic. I think where this is really coming from, as you said, is my desire to explore my own roots. There's been a, a lot of academic research done on this topic. There's obviously been a lot of works published, and I would encourage people to refer to that. I think my motivation to do this was, one, to kind of share my side of the story, share kind of where I feel this whole story comes from, how it impacts us in our lives, till today, for me and my kids, etc. But ultimately, also one motivation was to, as you said, resurface this topic, encourage people in the community to kind of look deeper, understand, what transpired, what that means for them today, and hopefully cultivate a larger sense of pride and a sense of community. Yeah, I think that's something I'd like to start off with, and definitely I'd encourage people to refer to the show notes, read some of the works. I think there's one author I would like to give credit to before I start, which forms a lot of the basis for what I'm going to say, what I'm going to talk about. That's Nandita Bhavnani. She's written a book called The Making of Exile. So yeah, I encourage people to read that if it's of interest.
I'll add the book cover and
Yeah.
the link, the Amazon link in the show notes as well. So Kunal, I've introduced you know what the outline of this podcast
Yeah.
is, but I've barely introduced
Yeah.
you. So why not start
Sure.
from a little bit, like tell us a little bit about who you are as a person.
Sure. I
And
mean, I'll start off with, as a Sindhi, and of course, this is the topic of the podcast in terms of
yeah,
migration. And so, as you would have then surmised, is, I didn't grow up in Sindh because we
yeah,
were exiled,
yeah,
which meant I had the privilege of spending I was born in and had the privilege of spending the first half of my childhood in Barcelona in Spain. Moved to Dubai, second half of my childhood, which is where I finished school. Also spent the early part of my career there. And for the last 10 years, I've been in Singapore. Have extended family here in Indonesia as well. We've been living here for 10 years. Both my kids were born in Spain because we went back for the deliveries. It's still, a country that's home to us, as so is Dubai. Um, but yeah, I think both my kids are very much now integrated into Singapore. Yeah, and we've been here since.
yeah. So you've been like in many ways, I do relate to that because I was born in one place and then raised in a different place and went college in a different
Mm.
place, started my professional life in a different place, and then moved to Singapore. So for me, where is home is like
Yeah,
always,
yeah, it's always
you
a
know,
struggle. I mean, not to mention the fact that, I do say I'm Indian, so, although never having lived in India, but of course speak the language, eat the
yeah,
food, watch cricket, so I'm very much Indian in that sense, right? So it's a nice, I mean, I'd say it's a privilege, and I'll talk about the downsides of
yeah,
having this kind of experience. But first and foremost, I would say it's a privilege because it gives you the sense of being a truly global citizen. I can, it's almost like a chameleon, right? So I can change who I am depending on who I'm with. If I'm in Spain, I'm with my, friends there. If I'm in Dubai, I have friends from all over the Middle East, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, you name it, right? In Singapore, I have, Singaporean Chinese friends, Sindhis who grew up in Singapore. I relate to my cousins in Indonesia. I have to be a different way around them, or I don't have to be, but I can kind of blend in and find my
yeah,
way. There's pros and cons, but yeah, overall it's been an interesting experience, and a life that I think very few people get to live.
yeah, yeah. So let's start from the very beginning of what we are going to focus on for today's show. Um, why don't you set up a little bit of a context
Sure.
of, what was Sindh like, or what was going on around the partition years? And obviously, we don't need to go back. It's a civilizational story, but we don't need to go back all the way. But let's start at a certain point in history around the partition of India and Pakistan, and use that to set the context of uh, what was going on at that point in time.
Sure. I mean, as you said, we could start as far back as the Indus Valley civilization, but that would take a very long time, I think. But just to give you a sense, I mean, it's a society in place that's been around for centuries, right? But yeah, I think where we'll start is what's, I think, a pivotal point in the history of the province, which is kind of the mid to late 1940s. So really, I mean, the partition, as we know, happened in 1947. The Sindhi Hindu population was a minority at the time, so about 25% of the population, just over a million Sindhi Hindus. Mostly, these people were, or they were kind of merchants, working professionals, teachers, lawyers, etc. Mainly urban dwellers, so cities like Karachi today, Hyderabad, Shikarpur. And I think the sense was that they all played a very key role in the economy. Uh, so that played various roles economically, and they dominated what was, the kind of sense of commerce in the province and in the cities. Whereas the Sindhi Muslims were tended to be mostly agricultural or workers living on the outskirts and so on. So there was that distinction. But having of course, it's not a hard and fast rule. Of course, there were people from both communities all over the province, but that was broadly speaking the makeup of how things look like. Again, encourage people to read more about it. This is just one snippet of information. And generally, relations between Sindhi Hindus, Sindhi Muslims were fairly communal. There was, at least as, whatever reading I've done of that period, it was very peaceful. My grandfather, anecdotally, who was, born and lived in Karachi, I mean, I've heard stories from within the family that, he had many Muslim friends. In fact, he dressed like a Muslim. He wore a Muslim cap, in terms of his attire. He probably spoke like them. I mean, he was fully integrated. So you can see the sense of um, community that was built. And I don't think there was, um, the difference of religion was not I don't think it was something that was, tearing at the fabric of society at the time. I think the pivotal moment really was, in the lead up to partition in 1947, once the British left pre-partition India. At that point, effectively, there was a little bit of pressure that the Sindhi started facing. So I think one thing to mention here is that Sindh itself was not partitioned, right? So if you think of Punjab, if you think of Bengal, those states were split in two. Part of it was in India. Part of it was then given to Pakistan.
Mm.
And because Sindh was not partitioned, I think people don't know what happened after that point of 1947 to the Sindhi Hindu population, right? As I said, things were fine. We were dominating in commerce, controlled a large part of the economy. A lot of wealth was generated and created. But because the state was not split, it was kind of absorbed into Pakistan. So it was like, okay, that's end of story. So as you said at the beginning of the podcast, that Sindhi Hindus then became almost a footnote.
So, 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 so if I understand this right, there is like peace between the Sindhi Hindus and the Sindhi Muslims. There's commerce going on. There is a lot of cultural exchange which is happening between between both of them, and everything is fine. But the partition happens, and after partition or during partition, a lot of hell breaks loose, and migration results out of it. So what were the kind of triggers which created a scenario wherein migration was inevitable, or because people who have lived all their lives, like generations after generations, in a certain place and in a certain way, what could possibly have gotten them to the point that they feel compelled that they wanted to migrate or they had to migrate?
Yeah, you touched on something which I think we'll come back to maybe towards the end. But that was, the ability to live side by side. I think that resulted in actually an interesting blend of spiritual and religious traditions, but we'll come back to it. I mean, that was the depth of connection, right? Just the highlight between the two communities. But in terms of what resulted in the ultimate migration, I think the narrative is that it wasn't an immediate thing. It was not an inevitable thing that, oh, now countries split up, Hindus have to leave. I don't think it played out in that way. Whereas in a state like Punjab, I think it was maybe a lot more violent at times, a lot faster. You hear of the killing trains where, trains would arrive with dozens of corpses. So it was very visible in the media, it was very visible in the narrative, but with Sindhi Hindus, I think it was a slow process, right? So it was not like, okay, partition's done and we have to go. I think most Sindhi Hindus stayed very hopeful. They waited to see how things would play out. I think at some level, as a worst case, many thought that, okay, Muslim state, but the community will be a Hindu minority in a Muslim state, right? And that happens in many states around the world, right?
Yeah.
But I think the discrimination and violence was it was a creeping process. So it started obviously 14th August 1947, which was, it was the Independence Day of Pakistan. But there was an event in the historical narrative, which is 6th of January 1948, and that's when kind of concerted riots broke out against Hindus in the state. It targeted the shops, their homes, their temples, and I think once things reached that level, I think it was then really a decision that a lot of people were forced to take, right? I would say that, again, the narrative also states that the violence may not have entirely been state sponsored. So it was not, I don't think the newly created Pakistan was deliberately targeting the Hindu population in the state, but I think tensions fled between the Hindus and Muslims, and one potential reason was there was a wave of arrivals from India, Muslim arrivals who had, themselves been displaced from India, who were coming into the newly Muslim dominant state, Pakistan. They felt that, they had to compete for homes, for jobs, resources were scarce. So, one easy, or not easy, but one obvious target was, okay, the Hindus now have their own state, so why don't we take over their homes? Why don't we take over their businesses? Why don't we take over their land? And that's when really the tension started, right? Sindhi Hindu property was lucrative. People were essentially going in and occupying those homes, right? And kind of you were threatened with violence if you didn't leave, right? So it created a climate of a lot of fear. There was eventually, I think, a collapse in trust in the government's ability to protect us in the population. As I said, the violence wasn't, hard and fast like in Punjab, for example, but I think ultimately people felt that, okay, this may not be sustainable for the long term.
Mm, mm. And was it like an en masse kind of a migration, or was it happening in like spurts? And where were people kind of migrating towards?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it was, so 1947, 48 was the trigger, but I don't think it happened all at once. So, the story is that, say, between 1947 and 1950, so a period of 3 to 4 years, is when people gradually left, right, as and when they could. And I think by 1951, most of the 1.2 million Sindhi Hindus had left, mostly to post-partition India. In terms of the journey, it's actually quite interesting. So if you went by ship, you ended up in Maharashtra, mostly Bombay, port of Bombay, now Mumbai. If you went by foot and then by train, you ended up in states of Rajasthan, Gujarat. So it was quite varied in terms of where the destination was. My own maternal grandparents crossed over into Rajasthan. So my mom was born in a town in Rajasthan called Barmer. Eventually, they moved on to Jodhpur. That's where she grew up, spent most of her childhood there. My paternal grandparents went to Ujjain, which is in MP. And my maternal grandparents, incidentally, after Rajasthan, moved to Dubai. On my dad's side, the family from Ujjain then moved on to Indonesia, eventually to Singapore. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And was the resettlement period, like what was the chaos like that was happening around that resettlement process? Like, what was? What was that like? It must not have been easy.
Yep, yep. So, I mean, one thing is leaving, and that too leaving with, the clothes on your back and kind of whatever you can carry with you. And, on the way, you may get robbed, you may get mugged, you may get harassed, assaulted,
Mm,
even killed, right? I mean, there was that whole
mm,
perilous side of the journey. And in fact, actually, I forgot to mention that the uh, the Karachi municipal authorities had actually, for a period, and you can read more about this, but they had actually stopped or banned the outflow of Sindhi Hindus because
yeah.
um, the community was so intertwined with the economy and controlled so much of the economy and commerce in the province
Mm,
that they slowly realized, like, hey, with this exodus of these guys,
mm,
the economy is falling apart. So they actually started to ban people, have checks at the port and so on.
mm,
So perversely, it became even harder to leave because they didn't want you to leave. But then at the same time, it was like, well, you're not exactly protecting the community, right? So,
mm,
so I think the guys, those who got out sooner probably had it slightly easier in terms of the at least the process logistics of getting out.
mm,
Um, but those who left later may have had a harder time. But yeah, ultimately, once you get there in terms of resettlement, I think it was not easy by any means.
mm,
As I said, most people only had the possessions that they had on them. They left their homes behind. They left all their wealth behind. They left their, the whole network and community that they had built behind. It was essentially a loss of, more than possession, but the entire identity, right? So then going in, um, the newly created India in the first instance, there was no real resettlement plan, right, by the Indian government,
mm,
because the state was not partitioned. So again, I'll use the example of Punjab, where it's split into two. So the Hindus who were living on the Pakistani side of Punjab were resettled into the new Punjab, right? Similar story in Bengal, the creation of Bangladesh, East Pakistan. Then, um, so there was no plan.
mm,
These Sindhi Hindus are coming over. What's the plan? There was no state assistance.
mm,
Initially, I think the only solution really was that, okay, well, there's these informal refugee camps. So effectively, you're a refugee now, um,
mm,
within newly created Indian territory. These camps were, from what I've read, were hostile. They were not clean. They were confusing. I mean, you're living your life in Sindh, in Karachi, Hyderabad, wherever. And then all of a sudden you find yourself in a camp, right? Where there's no kind of sanitary conditions are horrendous. You really have nothing, right? So you have to start from scratch. So it was chaotic. It was chaotic. Uh, some of the refugee camps I'll call out are in Ulhasnagar, which is near Bombay.
mm,
Um, eventually became a Sindhi industrial hub. Ahmedabad also hosted some of the major resettlement centers. But it was, as I said, there was no Sindh to go to. So unlike Punjab, I could go from West Punjab to East Punjab. There was no Sindh to go to. So in reality, the community was spread all over the country.
mm, mm. And and did people remain in the camps, or like, was there like some issues that they were facing with, this new region where they
Yeah.
were they welcomed at least by the
Uh,
community,
I
the
mean,
Indians?
so there's a mixed narrative, but I think the, dominant kind of narrative is that even if they were welcomed, firstly, they had nothing. So they had to, start whatever small business you could start, again, with the lineage of being traders and merchants. I think that was seen as, okay, this is what we know how to do. Let's start a business, trading something or the other,
Mm.
or be a small restaurant.
What
Yeah.
were they? Was it even possible to interact? Like,
Yeah.
like, because I believe the Sindhi culture is slightly different from the
Yeah.
cultures in India. So,
No, so that was a big issue. So the culture
mm,
was perceived as alien. I mean, you can think of,
mm,
the culture of Gujarat, whilst, we're very similar in many ways, but we're also very different, right?
mm,
Culture in Rajasthan, Maharashtra. So I think the Sindhi Hindus were perceived as, retaining some very not Indian nuances, which come um, from connection to Islam, connection to, parts of Sikhism.
Mm,
The Sindhi language, it's of Indo-Aryan origin, but, during the kind of Islamic rule period of the province, kind of transitioned to an Arabic Perso script. So it's written like Urdu is.
mm,
The language itself was marginalized. I think it only became an official language in India in 1967. Um, the Sindhi Hindus, we like to eat meat, we like to drink alcohol, we like to party. We were noisy, very liberal in that sense, wearing colorful clothes. Having said that, there are many conservative traditions. Gender roles were very traditional and formal, clear segregation between what a man and woman can do. But at the same time, very different from, my vegetarian Brahmin neighbor, my new neighbor, right? They're like, what's
mm,
going on in this guy's house, right? So I think it was challenging. I mean, I put it in a kind of with a slightly with a touch of humor, but I think there was real challenges, right? I mean, you're not going to be accepted, right? You speak differently, you eat differently, you dress differently, versus someone who had this idea of what traditional Hinduism and Hindu values and vegetarianism and those things are supposed to be. Whereas here come these guys who are, yeah, they say they're Hindus, but you know they look like more like Persians, or they seem to have this Sufi connection, and some of them are Sikh going to gurdwaras. Like, what's going on, right? It's kind of this really weird, and we'll touch on that a bit later.
yeah, yeah.
So it was challenging. It was challenging, I think. Yeah.
And if you can bring to life what was the impact of this displacement on the identity, because it's like literally
Yeah. I
everything
mean, you're just taken
everything
out.
you have
Yeah.
ever been has been questioned.
Yep. Yep. So, I mean, look, I said, we were dispossessed of land, dispossessed of homes, temples, networks, your businesses. Um, so it was not just, and beyond that, as I said, then your culture is seen as foreign, right? Again, you don't have a sin to go to, so everyone's like, hey, like, why are you here? So it was more than, I think forced migration. I think it was a destruction of kind of who you were, right? So
Yeah,
how can you then go back and rebuild, right? And the other thing is, because there's no sin to go to, you're spread out all over India. Yes, you have these camps and so on, but how do you actually rebuild a community from that, right?
mm,
I think what makes it worse is, as you mentioned in the beginning, is there's not much mention of this story in the story of partition. When we talk about partition, I mean, even the movies you'll see, like Punjab and the killing fields there and so on. Uh, so in a way, not only have you lost physical possessions, you go to the new place, you've lost culture. So that's two things. And then the third thing is, no one's even talking about you, because they're like, wait, you're fine. Like, what happened, right? You're actually
yeah,
fine. And I think there's also the narrative of most people being told that, hey, just be grateful. It was not as violent. You're fine. Just rebuild, right? You haven't lost anything. By and large, you're okay. So stop complaining and get on with it, right?
mm,
So I think one that's, again, I'll go back to my motivation for this chat, is also to bring that story out, not in a kind of negative way, or in a way to complain about the past, but I think it's important that people realize that, hey, we've kind of also been through this. It's ended, in a place where things eventually turned out fine, but it's a large part of the partition discourse.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The one thing that I'm really struggling, and now with this context, it's starting to make sense, but I'm still help throw light on this, which is that when you think about the Sindhi Hindu community today,
Mm.
the people I have met over the years, interacted with, worked with, and all, it's very hard to imagine this community coming from a background that the way you described, and there's so much strife and like so
Well,
much uh, pain which is there, because you know um, in my mind, the Sindhi community is a very, very different community the way I have seen.
Yeah,
Right.
it doesn't
So
look like we've been through much pain. And again,
yeah,
I'll caveat that, my generation hasn't been through any of that pain, so I'm not gonna claim
yeah,
that I've suffered that, right? So all credit
yeah,
to
yeah.
prior
So
generations. But yeah, it doesn't appear like it today.
it doesn't appear like that. So how did things start changing? Like
Yeah.
when did things start changing? How did things start changing?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, as I said, you were in your province, you were not asked to leave, but you were kind of almost, pushed out over time for a variety of reasons. Um, Went into, post-partition, independent India. Things are not great there. You are in these camps, with your kids, with your wives, your, husbands, full entire families, right? So where do you go from there, right? So I think there was a large portion of Sindhi Hindus who decided to eventually leave, right? Leave India. Um, they went to, more far away shores. I think the idea was that you relocate to the cities that you are familiar with from your prior pre-partition trading links. So Sindhis would travel even pre-partition as merchants to further their trading activities. So let's say I knew, in my grandfather's case, for example, I traded with Indonesia. I know Jakarta. I may have been there a few times. I may have even been there for long stretches of times, right? Because remember, they used to travel by ship to trade and maybe stay there for all 6 months or a year. I don't know how long, right? So I knew the place. I kind of knew the language. I got business connections. So let me just, hop on the next ship and try to, restart a new life there because maybe there's nothing much for me in India at this point, right? So those trading hubs were actually a path to then, survival and growth. And for a lot of the men, they would take the journeys initially, um, sometimes go there years on end to really set up a base. And so the women and children would be left behind in their new Indian homes, maybe for some years. And then they would kind of join them once for permanent relocation once things um, had stabilized, right? So, I mean, today you'll find, as a result of this process, I think you'll see Sindhis in particular in practically all parts of the world, right?
Yeah.
And mostly these are port cities, logically, right? You can now follow the train of how things transpired. So, Sindhis in Santiago in Chile, Panama City, Barcelona, where I grew up initially, Tenerife, even all across Asia, right? So Asia is actually more dominant with Sindhi population. So Dubai, I think, is the largest Sindhi hub outside of India today.
Mm.
Cities like Hong Kong, Singapore, obviously, Jakarta, I mean, I can go on, right? A lot have also stayed behind in India. In fact, there's a larger Sindhi diaspora within India than outside. So many did stay back, but they also continue to live and thrive there, right? I think cities like Ahmedabad, Jodhpur, Mumbai still have significant populations.
Mm. Mm. And like, you have mentioned you have mentioned a couple of times about, there's a little bit of a silence when
Um,
it comes to this topic, and even within the community.
um,
uh, why is that the case? And like, what really transpired since then?
yeah, that's a good point. I'll go back to that, that statement I made. There was no Sindh. So, I mean, at least for the Sindhi Hindus, there was no new Sindh, right? So,
Mm.
and stayed back in the Pakistani sort of territory. So that made Sindhis kind of just, in a way, Sindhi Hindus, in a way, keep their heads down. I think the feeling was that, we need to, wherever we are, whether within post-partition India or, the other cities and countries I mentioned, we need to put our heads down. Let's kind of put all that behind us. The government's not helping us anyway in any significant way. There are aspects that were put in place, but again, it was not to the extent that was necessary. So that made Sindhi, adaptive. I think I'll use the word translocal. So you kind of adapt into the society that you find yourself in. And as I mentioned at the beginning, also eventually made us into global citizens. But so there was an idea that, okay, let's put that all behind us. I'm in Spain or I'm in Dubai or I'm in Singapore. Um, let me integrate, where I've landed now. So that meant learning local languages, learning local customs. So it's very much a survival tool, right? So it's not I don't think it was a thought out process that, hey, we need to erase what happened to us. Well, firstly, as I said, no one was really talking about it anyway, and to the extent that other topics around partition were spoken about. But it was a survival tactic, and whilst we found new routes, whilst we found new communities, and as I said, it's a blessing to have had the privilege of being in so many cultures, right? I mean, as I said, I can blend into practically any culture, right?
Yeah.
At this point, and not only blend in, I actually understand their nuances, and that's something very special, right? So if I'm with my, let's say, Lebanese friends, I know, like, I like their food. I love Lebanese food, right? So, and I know I can't speak Arabic, but I know where they come from. I know, their historical narrative. I know I can connect deeply with them. Same thing for, let's say an Indonesian, I can kind of adapt to their customs. And so, anyway, digressing a bit, but I think the ultimate reality was that, having had to do that over and over and over, integrate into others' cultures, I think it's left the community a bit without roots. And this is the negative aspect I was speaking about earlier, where
Yeah.
yes, you're happy and things have worked out well and you're in these new spaces, but inside you're like, well, where's my home, right? Where's my land? Where's my, um, where do I belong? Because if you belong everywhere, ultimately you belong nowhere. I mean, that's kind of a thing that keeps coming to my mind as well.
Right.
So it's, I think the only thing we then cling on to is the language, which is also dying, which, I'll touch on. The thing that we cling on to is the food. I love Sindhi food as well. Our customs. The customs, again, we can talk more about, but, it blends, as I said, various facets. It blends Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism,
And
Sufism.
mm,
But retaining that culture has been a challenge. And, there still is a lingering sense of shame and marginalization, right? So today, many folks don't speak Sindhi because, they've not learned it. I mean, the parents moved on. They didn't think it was necessary. You would rather learn the language that, you are, whichever country you're in, learn that local language. And today, I think most, at least my generation, maybe it's even less with the next generation. Although I don't want to, pass a judgment on that. Of course, there's many that retain the values, but most people, I think, you'll find a blend of varying degrees of attachment to the culture and to the customs.
mm,
The blend is, okay, I have this traditional Sindhi side of me, and where I know and I deeply connect with the tradition and customs, but then I also have this global side of me, which, I'm more, let's say, from Dubai or, from Singapore. So it's this unique mix.
mm, mm. So, so tell us about, um, let's come to the present day,
Mm.
and let's talk a little more about, uh, despite or in spite of this legacy and all, when you look at yourself as a community, right? Uh, what are the tenets about this community that you think other people are looking at when they are looking at the community as a whole?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with how we see ourselves, and then, maybe how the world perceives us.
Yeah.
So from my vantage, again, this is my personal view, right? What I can see is that the community has produced individuals, families, communities who are, recognized today globally for their business success, right?
Mm.
Business acumen, business success. I think there's no, I'd be hard pressed to find an industry or at least a major country that's not been touched by the Sindhi Hindu diaspora today.
Mm.
Like I said, we're literally everywhere, right? Everywhere I go, I'll find at least one Sindhi family, and the community is very, very close knit. And I always say that a Sindhi home in any country um, is open to any other fellow Sindhi, right? I'll always be welcome. I'll always be called in for a meal. So it's very useful to have that. It's almost like a global, private society or network, right? Which is very interesting. And this is again a result of the struggles of partition, where if I arrived in Indonesia first, you followed 2 years later, I will help you, right? So I know the lay of the land. I know how business works. I'll assist you, and that's carried on till this day.
Mm.
Um, and in terms of how people, so again, sorry, I'll continue with that a little bit. So the way I see it is it's a story of trauma, but it's also a story of even more so of resilience. So it was a journey of being kind of pulled out, being forced to rebuild in unfamiliar places, and then really rising again out of that, right? Um, one aspect to your question on, how are Sindhis perceived and so on, I think there's this narrative that, especially propagated in Bollywood movies from the 90s and so on, which has, is this stingy businessman, with a lot of money, or very flashy, and it's fine. I mean, I can take a joke, but sometimes it's seen without context. It's a little bit disparaging. I think the connection to wealth and materialism comes from the fact that suddenly 75 years ago you had a lot, and suddenly you had nothing. So the connection to money really became that money is, I think, now seen as a shield. It's seen as a way to protect future generations. It symbolizes, the ability to be independent. It symbolizes survival. It symbolizes security. And today, money is, for, again, there's various degrees of wealth even in the community, but I would say by and large, the community is successful. Money is, you know, um, not lacking, if not abundant, for many families. But the meaning of money runs deep, right? So it's not just that I love flash and I like nice cars, and of course, there's that segment of the society, I won't deny it. But I think by and large, at least to me personally, and I know to people within my own family, it's a memory of suffering. It's a collective memory of suffering. It's in some ways a vow that this community will never fall to such lows and depths again. And it's also a sign of, it's fine. Doesn't matter what happens. We'll rebuild. We'll come back. And it's, today we're a self-sufficient, thriving community. We give back to the community. We give back to society. We continue to contribute positively to any culture, any country in the world. And importantly, we integrate, right? So not creating kind of ghettos or silos within the countries we come to, right? I think the example I'll use is, I think it was a couple of years ago. I'll probably need to check exactly when, but former Singapore PM Lee Hsien Loong held an event a few years ago commemorating the Sindhi society's contribution to Singapore, and that's a narrative that plays out again and again, right? We're small. We're, I don't know, maybe less than 1% of Singapore population wise, but it's an outsized contribution, right? It's that ability to kind of stand up and say, we're here, we count. Yes, I don't have my land, but now your land is my land, but I'm not taking it away. I'll contribute to it, right? I'll make a genuine positive contribution, and you will value that, right? And you will not say, hey, who are these guys? Why are they here, right? So I think that's been the mentality. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There are a few things which always kind of stand out when it comes to Indies, and the first thing that comes to my mind is that and I want to know if there's a story behind it or not. But like the first thing that stands out to me is you can recognize a Sindhi person by their names. And like, you just need to tell me your name and I know you're Sindhi. And is there a story behind that?
Yeah, so I don't know the exact roots, but I can tell you what it means. So the ani or ani suffix essentially means descendant of. So my
Mm.
name is,
So Adnani.
yes,
Okay.
I'm descendant of Adnan, which
Mm.
interestingly is an Arab name. So I don't know who my forefather was. So there's
Mm.
definitely a connection to the Middle East there. In fact, I did a DNA test a few years ago, and it showed up as, I think, around 50 odd percent as South Asian, which is Indo-Aryan, North Indian. But the balance was basically like Middle Eastern, Persian, all of that. So I'm the descendant of Adnan. I don't know who Adnan was, but when you Google the name, it's an Arabic name, right?
Mm.
So that's, and there's many. There's, for example, Ramchandani, so descendant of Ramchand, which is a more Hindu sounding name. But yeah, so that's it's usually linked to paternal ancestor, maybe great great grandfather. So it was a way to identify, you know, who you descended from, kind of almost a little bit tribal in that sense. There's another suffix. I mean, I think there's a few, but the other one I'll point out is ja, so Ja, that signifies coming from a certain place. Um,
Mm.
so, for example, Shivdas Ja, so from Shivdas. So that could signify your hometown. Um,
Mm.
I think there's other variants which signify your ancestral profession. So it really varies, but that's hopefully gives you a context of where these names are coming from, and yeah, it makes it almost as you said today, it's a unifying trait, so easily identifiable by the surname.
Yeah. Well. And I'm also trying to understand because, there was a fluid spiritual culture
Mm,
already, in early Sindh. And then the partition happened, and then as a community, it is a community which tries to integrate into the new
mm,
culture wherever they are. So tell us about a little more about the whole spiritual traditions
mm.
around the Sindhi community.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So, I mean, where I'll start is I think our patron god or patron deity, which is Julelal.
Mm.
Uh, is considered the patron saint of for Sindhi Hindus. He's an incarnation of, again, this is, based on some of the reading I did, but incarnation of Varuna, which is the Vedic god of water. Um, but I think for the community, it's not just being a religious figure. I think he's a symbol of unity, right? Um, we celebrate his birth annually, which marks the Sindhi New Year. Again, people celebrate to various degrees, but at least we're aware, that okay, this is our kind of religious day. He's associated with the Indus River, again, linking back to the Indus Valley civilization, which runs across the province. And it shows, and because of that connection to the river, he's often, portrayed as sitting on a fish. And I think, if you take the context of what transpired post-partition, that symbolizes, fluidity, migration, travel, linking also back to merchant routes pre-partition. So there's a lot of symbolism around that. And there's an interesting legend actually that, there was, I think around the 10th century where one of the Islamic rulers at the time who was present in the Sindh province was threatening to impose Islam on the Hindu population, and Julilal kind of appeared as a savior to protect the Sindhi Hindu community. But having said that, over the years, I think the Sindhi Hindus themselves adapted a lot of Islamic, I would say mostly Sufi Islamic traditions, and kind of blended that into their unique form of Hinduism, right? So that's one aspect of change that happened. There's a famous Sufi saint, Shahbaz Qalandar, Lal Shahbaz Qalandar, and you may have heard his name from the song, right? The
Yes, I was about to ask you about that.
So it refers to him. He was again, I think around the 10th, 11th, 10th century, sorry, 12th century Sufi ascetic born in Iran. Eventually made his way to Sindh, and that province still holds the largest shrine that is dedicated to him. Again, he was a Islamic Sufi saint, but because he was wandering, a wandering mystic through the Sindh province, he attracted a lot of Hindu um, followers as well, and it became the shrine, till date is a symbol of interfaith belief, right? Linked to mysticism, linked to kind of the higher power and truth, rather than having the community split alongst strict religious lines, or where I'm Hindu, no, I'm Muslim. I think there was a lot of back and forth, and even Julilal, who's meant to be Hindu, is seen by people in the province as a protector of the province. So I think it's hard to then distinguish between what really defines your spiritual faith. Of course, I'm not Muslim, so I'm not going to follow it to the extent of following the prayers 5 times a day, etc., etc. Of course, I'm not saying that's the case, and nor are the Muslims Hindus, but there was this cultural fluidity which existed, and that enabled the cohabitation that I was referring to, right? The ability to live side by side in peace. In fact, interestingly, the song "Dama Kalandar" also
Yeah.
sings then in the next line about Julilal. So it's like you fuse the two religious aspects into one, right? So it's
Mhm.
ultimately about the higher power, about community, about strength as a region, right?
Well, we'll put the song in the edit later.
Yeah, that would be cool.
The last thing I must ask is, and this is probably the most defining trait when I think of Sindhis, is this whole boisterous, fun-loving side of
Mm.
Sindhis. And you know, is there a story behind it, or like where does that come from?
I mean, it's hard to pinpoint, I think, one aspect, but I think it was that, I mean, again, personal opinion, right? Probably you see so much hardship when things are finally okay, you want to, enjoy to the maximum extent possible. Um, Wealth, as I said, is a symbol of I'm here, I've done it, right? I've kind of against all odds. Um, but also culturally, I think, as I said, that spiritual fluidity, um, adopting Sufism, adopting parts of Hinduism, but not in a very strict or, you know, in a way which you will allow religion to dictate your life. I don't think that's the case. So it's more of a spiritual nuance where it allows you to, just enjoy the finer things in life. And that's been the philosophy generally, that you only live once, you've been through all of this, you have resources, just have fun, right? Of course, that veers in many cases into kind of crass displays of wealth, which I don't fully agree with, but to each his own. I think that's fine. But that's really it. We like to have fun. I mean, I remember as a kid even going to, like, you're so sleepy, right? As a kid, like it's like 10 p.m. and like I'm ready for bed, but you're still at your parents' friends or family's house. They're having a party. They're like whiskey bottles are being opened, and it's just massive like event, and you're just like, I just want to go home and sleep, right? But there was no regard for it. Was like, no, we're all here, like this is family or community event, and we're gonna and everyone will come in their best clothes, and uh, so I think it was really that, also a desire to preserve community. um, so let's get together, let's have a good time. And then, next day you wake up and you kind of work hard again. But even at work, there's community, right? Because you work together, you help each other, you compete with each other. But yeah, that's essentially it.
Mm, very nice. Kunal, I don't know in how many words I can, or how many ways I can thank you for
Thank you.
bringing this story, sharing this story with with me and the wider audience who'll be watching this. And let's go back to the purpose that you stated at the very beginning of this episode, was that to keep this conversation alive, to resurface, the story of exile and the hardships and all. And I really want, if I can play a very small role in the process of helping spread the awareness, I'll feel blessed if I can do that. But it would be wonderful if this conversation continues, and I encourage everyone who has a story to share, who has some thoughts to share, please feel free to share and keep this conversation alive. Do the additional reading on this subject from a lot of sources that Kunal has referred to, and we'll put them down in the show notes as well. Um, yeah, so thank you very much for sharing this story. Before I let you go, any last thoughts? Like, is there anything that probably I didn't ask you that you would want to
No, I think,
elaborate?
firstly, thanks for having me. I think it was very enjoyable for me to relive and talk about the whole thing, rather than just reading about it and not really sharing it with anyone, right? So very nice to speak about it. I think the only thing I'll add is I've probably just scratched the surface. I've given you hints of, what transpired, again, which I didn't experience firsthand, and I have not experienced that hardship, thanks to the prior generations who have, rebuilt and given us a platform from which we can grow. So very, very thankful, and very humbled by that progression. But yeah, I've only just scratched the surface. I think there's so much more. Um, you know, there's people within the community who think very differently from me, who are, still very traditional in their ways, who preserve a lot of the culture, and I'm very respectful of that. Um, it's diverse. The story is much deeper than this. So yeah, I would encourage, if it's a topic that's of interest, especially to members of the community, read, ask questions, ask family members. I probably need to get better at that. Asking my maternal grandfather is still with us. I probably need to sit down with him and ask him more questions. I haven't done that, right? So again, it's a topic that's not spoken about so often, maybe because of the trauma, right? Yeah, so encourage people to kind of dig deeper if it's something that's of interest.
Thank you for being on the Decoded podcast, Kunal. It was lovely, lovely having you and hearing the story.
Thanks so much.